The Second World War did not start with the tanks rolling over Poland. It started long before that, with humiliation, hunger, and revenge. Following World War I, Germany was shattered. The Treaty of Versailles didn't bring peace. It planted the seeds of something far worse. Into the wreckage walked a man with a blood-soaked vision, Adolf Hitler. This is more than a story of one dictator. It's the story of how the entire world watched, appeased, and hoped as Europe conducted its march straight into another catastrophe. So, what really started World War II? When the guns of World War I fell silent in 1918, Germany was not just defeated, it was destroyed. The once proud empire lay disarmed, humiliated, and starving. Across its cities, revolutions simmered. The Kaiser had fled, the great monarchy had fallen, and a fragile experiment, the Weimar Republic, was born into chaos. Then came the Treaty of Versailles, 1919. It wasn't peace. It was punishment. Germany was forced to accept full guilt for the war, known as the War Guilt Clause. Its colonies were stripped away. It ceded more than 13% of its territory, including major industrial areas. Its army was cut back to 100,000 personnel, 0 tanks, 0 air force, 0 submarines. On top of that, it owed 132 billion gold marks, an impossible sum in war reparations. To the Germans, Versailles was strangulation. They denounced what they called a diktat, a dictated peace, not a negotiated one. Defeat didn't only smash Germany's armies, it shattered its spirit. Millions of veterans returned home disillusioned. They had endured mud, gas, and horror in the trenches, and now they were being treated as losers. Some refused to believe they had actually been defeated, but rather betrayed from within. Politicians, Jews, Marxists. This became the core of the stab-in-the-back myth, a conspiracy theory that the German military had been sabotaged by internal enemies. This lie spread like wildfire, and it provided something deeply intoxicating: someone to blame. Meanwhile, democracy arrived not with celebration, but with resentment. The Weimar Republic was regarded as a foreign imposition, dictated by victors. Newspapers were flooded with extremist rhetoric. Paramilitary groups, such as the Freikorps, roamed the streets, clashing with communists and intimidating dissenters. Many Germans did not want progress. They craved order, power, a return to imagined glory. In this fragmented terrain, extremist voices did not sound extreme. They sounded certain. And certainty was scarce in a country drowning in shame and chaos. By 1921, bread cost a few marks. By 1923, it cost billions. Inflation spiraled out of control. Middle-class savings evaporated. Men carried pay in wheelbarrows. Children played with worthless banknotes. Women traded heirlooms for bread. The mark had come crashing down, and with it, faith in the new republic. In the midst of this chaos, extremist voices only grew louder. On the left, there were communists advocating revolution. On the right, nationalists called for revenge. And at the center, a broken government tried to keep a republic from imploding. And then, out of a beer hall in Munich, one voice stood out from the rest: a decorated war veteran. A man with a piercing gaze, an explosive style, and an unshakable belief that Germany's fall had been no accident, but a betrayal: Adolf Hitler. He wasn't born into power. He was a failed artist, a fringe agitator, a man fueled by rejection and resentment. But he found in post-war Germany the perfect storm: national shame, economic collapse, and political chaos. In 1919, he became a member of the small, ultranationalist German Workers' Party. A few months later, he'd reinvented it, with a new name: the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. Its communication was basic, brutal, and effective. Germany had been betrayed by backstabbers. Weimar politicians were weak, corrupt, and Jewish-controlled. Communists were poisoning the state. Only a strong hand could restore order and greatness. In 1923, Hitler made his first move. Emulating Mussolini's march on Rome, he tried to stage the beer hall putsch, a coup in Munich. It failed. Police fired. 16 Nazis died. Hitler was arrested. But prison was no defeat. It was an opportunity. There in Landsberg prison, he dictated Mein Kampf, My Struggle, a manifesto to hate and the triumphant master race. Inside, he detailed his ideology: anti-Semitism, anti-communism, ultranationalism, and a belief that Germany must expand east for Lebensraum, living space. Few took it seriously. He was rejected as a lunatic with a mustache and a megaphone. But Hitler was learning. He would not use force to take power back. He would take it legally. By the late 1920s, the Nazi Party was still quite small. But then, the world changed. October 1929, Wall Street crashed. The Great Depression swept across the globe like a virus, and Germany, already crippled by debt, was hit hardest. Banks collapsed. Businesses shuttered. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. Democracy looked helpless. The Nazis looked like strength. Hitler crisscrossed the country by plane, the first politician to travel that way. His rallies were grand, theatrical, terrifying. His speeches touched every sore spot: the war lost, Versailles' shame, the present chaos. Jobs, stability, pride. He vowed to bring them all home. He promised to make Germany great again. Behind the scenes, the Nazi Party grew increasingly militant. The SA, or brown shirts, freely roamed the streets, assaulting political enemies, intimidating voters, and through sheer terrorism, creating the misleading impression of order. In the elections of July 1932, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag. Yet Hitler still wasn't chancellor. It was not until January 1933 when conservative elites, convinced they could control him, offered him the position. They were wrong. Hitler would soon follow up with the Enabling Act, which nullified the Weimar Constitution. Political parties were banned. Trade unions were outlawed. The Gestapo rose. Dissent vanished. He didn't just seize power, he erased the Republic. Now the man who once shouted in beer halls stood at the head of a new totalitarian state. But this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because even as Hitler was stifling opposition at home, he'd already turned his gaze outward, toward revenge, toward expansion, toward war. Before we move on to the next section, please don't forget to subscribe if you liked the video so far. By 1934, Hitler was more than just the chancellor. He was Führer, the leader of a nation prepared to rise again. Opposition had been crushed, civil liberties dismantled. The SS, now under Heinrich Himmler, replaced the SA and became the regime's blade. Every lever of state power was under Nazi control. Now Hitler turned outward. He had been honest about his aims: tear up the Treaty of Versailles, rebuild Germany's military, win back lost territory, and push east for Lebensraum. But he also knew he could not go too quickly. Not yet. So he began with defiance disguised as diplomacy. In 1935, Hitler implemented conscription, violating the Treaty of Versailles. Germany's new military, the Wehrmacht, was established, and planning for tanks, submarines, and an air force started at once. France and Britain objected, but did nothing. Then, in March 1936, Hitler took his first real risk. He deployed German troops into the Rhineland, a French-bordering demilitarized zone. It violated Versailles and the Locarno Pact openly. His generals feared retaliation. Even Hitler admitted that if the French had intervened, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. But France did nothing. Britain hesitated. The gamble paid off. And Hitler learned something crucial. The West would not stop him. Next came Austria. The idea of uniting all German-speaking peoples under one Reich, the Anschluss, had long been part of Hitler's dream. In March 1938, he insisted that Austria's chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, legalize the Nazi Party and allow it to operate freely. When Schuschnigg resisted, Hitler threatened invasion. The Austrian government crumbled. German troops entered the country without resistance. They were greeted with flowers and Nazi salutes. Austria was annexed without a single shot fired. The world again watched and did nothing. As Hitler absorbed Austria, he wasn't only acquiring territory, he was sending a message. The Germany that had been shackled by Versailles was now unafraid to act, and victorious. Nazi propaganda called it a homecoming. There were cheers on the streets of Vienna, where footage showed cheering crowds, but behind the camera, Jewish shops were smashed, dissidents rounded up, and opponents beaten. Overnight, Austria's Jews became subject to Nazi racial laws. There was international discomfort. but little resistance. U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt expressed concern but offered no concrete action. France was politically paralyzed. Britain, meanwhile, was still clinging to Chamberlain's belief that Hitler was a rational actor. Meanwhile, Germany's neighbors watched nervously. Czechoslovakia fortified its borders, but it was on its own. Lithuania quietly surrendered the Klaipėda region, Memel, in 1939 after German pressure, another bloodless victory for Hitler. Romania and Hungary made economic concessions, afraid they'd be next. Each move emboldened Hitler further. Each silence from the West became complicity. Every parade he staged, every handshake he extended, was a step closer to war, and the world applauded or looked away. In Britain, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain hoped Hitler could be reasoned with. He believed Germany was simply reclaiming what had been unfairly taken. The French, haunted by World War I, followed his example. Hitler now turned his attention to Czechoslovakia, with particular focus on the region of the Sudetenland, a mountainous border area inhabited by 3 million ethnic Germans. He launched a propaganda offensive alleging that Germans in the region were being oppressed. Tensions soared. War seemed inevitable. But in September 1938, with war looming, Chamberlain flew to Germany in a final bid to avoid conflict. He met Hitler in Berchtesgaden and again in Bad Godesberg. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland. Chamberlain agreed, without consulting Czechoslovakia. The agreement was finalized in Munich Conference on September 30th, 1938. No Czech representative was invited. Hitler pledged that it would be his last territorial demand. Chamberlain flew back to London, brandishing a piece of paper declaring peace for our time. But peace was an illusion. In March 1939, just 6 months after Munich, Hitler broke his promise. German forces then occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. There were no protests, no oppression, no ethnic conflict. It was just one more act of conquest. This time, even Chamberlain was unable to defend him. Britain and France issued an ultimatum. If Hitler invaded Poland, there would be war. But Hitler didn't believe them. Why would he? Every previous act of aggression had been met with appeasement or silence. And he wasn't finished planning. Behind closed doors, he struck a stunning pact with his ideological archenemy, Joseph Stalin. In August 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union concluded the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression pact in which they secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. The world was stunned. Nazis and communists had seemed like mortal enemies, but now they had split Poland on a map. Hitler believed he had eliminated the final obstacle. The Germans came over the Polish border at 4:45 a.m. on September 1st, 1939. Planes bombed cities. Tanks rolled across the countryside. Civilians fled in terror. It was blitzkrieg, lightning war. 2 days later, Britain and France were at war. World War II had started. But this wasn't just about Poland. The roots of the conflict ran deeper, through years of missed warnings, diplomatic failures, and blind optimism. Appeasement had bought time, not peace. And behind every speech, every parade, every handshake by Hitler, there was a plan far more diabolical than territory. Want to understand the world better? Start with history and subscribe to our channel. Before a single tank would cross a border, Nazi Germany had already declared war, not against another country, but upon its own people. From the start, Hitler's vision of the Third Reich was steeped in ideology. It was about more than just forfeited land or military might. It was about purity, racial, cultural, political. And so, while Europe watched Hitler's foreign moves with rising concern, a silent war was already raging inside Germany. Hitler had made the cornerstone of state terror only weeks after he seized power in 1933. It needed a pretext to suspend civil liberties, and the Reichstag fire afforded that. He had a free hand under the Enabling Act. The first concentration camp, Dachau, was not for Jews, but for political opponents, communists, trade unionists, social democrats. But soon, the targets widened. By 1935, the tickets were taken from them, and the Nazis instituted the Nuremberg Laws. These were not just laws, they were an announcement. Jews were no longer German citizens. They couldn't marry Aryans. They couldn't vote or hold public office. Even individuals with one Jewish grandparent were regarded as tainted. Suddenly, neighbors became pariahs, friends became threats, identity itself became a weapon. At the same time, Nazi propaganda intensified. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda flooded every radio, newspaper, and film with the same message. Jews were not just different, they were dangerous. In schools, racial science was taught to children. Biology textbooks described the superiority of the Aryan race. Teachers had to join Nazi organizations or they would be cast out. Youth programs like the Hitler Jugend and League of German Girls trained children to idolize Hitler and report on their parents. Meanwhile, racial science became a matter of state. The Nazis promoted the idea of Volksgemeinschaft, a people's community bound together by blood. That also meant everyone who did not fit the mold, Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, disabled people, the mentally ill, had no place in society. In 1934, Germany embarked on a vast, secretive campaign of forced sterilization. Over 400,000 people labeled genetically unfit were sterilized by Nazi doctors in the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. This wasn't some covert program. It was implemented in hospitals, overseen by judges and physicians. It was science weaponized, and the public was conditioned to accept that it was for the greater good. The Nazis called it racial hygiene. In reality, it was state-sponsored eugenics. By 1938, anti-Jewish policy turned from discrimination to open persecution. In November, after a young Polish Jew killed a German diplomat in Paris, the Nazis unleashed a coordinated attack across the Reich. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Over 1,400 synagogues were burned. Jewish shops were looted and smashed. 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Dozens were killed. Firefighters stood by as synagogues burned, instructed only to protect surrounding Aryan property. And the world again did little. After Kristallnacht, emigration skyrocketed, but Germany made it nearly impossible to leave. Jews had to forfeit nearly all their property. Some countries put strict limits on immigration. The doors were closing, just as the Nazis began accelerating the purge. After the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland, Nazi ideology didn't recognize Germany's borders. It went with the soldiers and flags into every newly liberated town. In Vienna, Jewish homes were looted within days. Regular Austrians, not SS officers, ransacked apartments, seized businesses, and humiliated former neighbors. In Prague, anti-Jewish propaganda was filling the streets even before the total occupation. The persecution became communal. Teachers fired colleagues, tenants reported landlords, clerks discovered grounds to dismiss Jewish workers. And always, someone else moved into the abandoned homes. Lots of Germans and Austrians weren't Nazis, but they didn't have to be to profit. They only had to stay silent or step up if the system made them an offer. The regime had not yet resorted to wholesale massacre. It relied on everyday complicity. And that may be the darkest truth of all. Hatred was not propagated only through fear. It spread through incentive. For millions, ideology was no more a burden. It was an opportunity. Meanwhile, another program to be conducted in secret was beginning to grow, the T4 euthanasia program. Beneath the banner of mercy, the Nazi state legalized the killing of children and adults with physical or mental disabilities by doctors. They were starved, injected with poison, or gassed. It was the initial experiment in mass murder on German soil, and a model for what would come in the East. By the end of World War II, Germany had become a society engineered for obedience and exclusion. Entire communities had been stripped of their rights. The press was silenced. Dissent was criminalized. The culture had been militarized, racialized, and radicalized. And perhaps most chilling of all, a lot of this had happened before a single shot had been fired abroad. Modern art was declared degenerate. Paintings were seized. Museums purged. Jazz music was labeled corrupt and un-German. Even church sermons were monitored. Pastors who did not fall in with the Reich's vision were silenced or arrested. Morality itself was redefined. The compassion was no longer compassion, it was weakness. What was cruelty had become patriotism. People adapted. Mothers taught children to identify racial differences. Textbooks compared Jewish noses and skulls to Aryan ideals. Schoolboys learned to report on classmates and sometimes their own families. By 1938, a country once synonymous with philosophy and science had been transformed into a weapon. And while fear played its role, it was often shame and pride that did the rest. Who wanted to be seen helping a Jew? Who dared to question orders when the radio said they were saving the fatherland? The invasion of Poland in 1939 didn't mark the beginning of Nazi brutality. It marked its expansion. The camps already existed. The killers were already trained. The propaganda had done its bit. Ordinary people had been transformed into enforcers, informants, bystanders. And as the Reich prepared for conquest, it carried with it not just weapons and soldiers, but blueprints for extermination. World War II didn't erupt in a single moment. It occurred silently, in speeches, in laws, in fear. It didn't start with guns, it started with ideas. Ideas that twisted humiliation into hatred, that promised strength through purity, that turned neighbors into enemies and silence into complicity. By the time tanks rolled into Poland, the war had already begun, in classrooms, in courts, in the minds of millions. So ask yourself, what truly starts a world war? A border crossed, or a lie believed too long? Let us know in the comments. Here's another video history buffs enjoyed watching. Bye for now.